you might have heard the expression, the right side of history. Or indeed, the wrong side of history. And it looked, didn't it, as Jesus was being crucified a few days later than we read, that Jesus was on the wrong side of history, because there was nothing more shameful than the death of the common criminal or slave or lowlife than to be crucified. That was to be on the loser's side of history. However, before that, we get this statement, don't we, in verse 19, that the whole world has gone after him. And it must have seemed that very much that way to his arch enemies, that is the Pharisees, that the whole world has gone after Jesus. They're despairing words, aren't they? They think the game is up, that they're on the wrong side, that they've lost. Of course, things would turn around. However, I want to investigate why I think these words are actually literally true. They were being spoken in a kind of a prophetic way. That's why they're recorded here. It is true to say that the whole world has gone after Jesus. And I want to show you 3 ways in which that is true. Here we see there's many people coming to celebrate Jesus, like football crowds on the road with their palm branches like waving flags, and they're recognizing the magnificence of Jesus. Well, let's think this through now, shall we? When Jesus was born, the world was a very different place. Culture was very different. Roman and Greek culture had set the tone, and it was very different. There were no cinemas, obviously, or movie theaters, but there were great amphitheaters. There's one, obviously, in Rome. That was built after Jesus, actually. But massive open-air buildings, like football stadiums, where thousands of people went to watch shows. Some of the most popular shows, I'm sure you know, involved gladiators fighting each other. They were very popular. People would flock to see these games and these contests, like people like watching football games today. But in the gladiatorial contest, people actually died. Imagine how you'd feel if you went to a football game, perhaps over here in the Olympic Stadium or the London Stadium, and someone actually died. Well, that has happened, hasn't it? And as we might remember, almost happened to Ericsson a few years ago in the World Cup. And what happened? It stopped the game at once. People were horrified. Everybody was horrified. Nobody had come to see people die. And if you went to a game like that, you might never want to see a football game again. But in Jesus' time, people went to shows like that where people died. That was the whole point of it. They wanted to see. That was their entertainment. They thought it was fun to see people die, like slaves or prisoners of war. People that no one cared enough about to make them feel sad. You see, at that time, people didn't think that all human lives are precious. This is what we call in our day human rights, equality. But actually, there was no sense of that in those days. Slaves or prisoners or people of other races or nationalities weren't important, weren't their people. They weren't precious. So you could watch them die and it was no problem. At that time too, people generally agreed that men were more important than women, that slavery was just fine, and that children and babies were property rather than precious people. And if you had a baby that you didn't want, especially if the baby was a girl or had a disability, it was perfectly fine just to leave the baby outside somewhere to die. Can you imagine? That was the kind of world that Jesus was born into. No one would think you were a bad person for doing that. Someone else might find the baby, bring her up as a slave, or else the baby would just die. There were no laws against such practices. Babies were property, so you could just throw them out if you liked. Now, it wasn't that people at that time didn't have any rules or didn't care at all about good and evil. They had some values like honor and bravery in battle. Being loyal to Rome was a great value for them. But their rules were different because their beliefs were different.